Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. This week, Politico released a new poll that contained some pretty big surprises. A larger than expected percentage of Americans say Donald Trump's criminal conviction in Manhattan makes them less likely to vote for him. The finding is even more striking among independents. What's interesting here as well, however, is that the Politico poll took an innovative step. It tried to gauge how important Trump's conviction is to voters in the larger scheme of things. And the answer is pretty important. Today we're chatting about this with Ankush Karduri, a senior writer for Politico magazine who oversaw this poll. He's going to take us through these findings and what they really mean. Great to have you back on, Ankush.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's walk through your top-line findings. You did the poll with Ipsos. You guys found that 33% of Americans say the conviction makes them less likely to vote for Trump, while only 17% say it makes them more likely. 33% is a big number. And you find that 32% of independents say they're less likely to support Trump. Also a big number. Can you talk about those findings?
The general top-line findings were, as you said, about a third of respondents across all affiliations said that they were less likely to support Trump. That was only offset by about 17%. And, that is a sizable number. It's a net number. Is roughly in line with what I would have expected, to be honest, because we did a little polling headed into this as well in terms of how people might view the verdict. And but of course, a hypothetical is very different from the reality. So now we're talking about people who have actually heard about and processed the verdict. We waited a week deliberately. We waited a week until after the verdict. I noticed a lot of pollsters were, I thought, very foolishly out in the field immediately. And I think that was unwise because I think this is a subject matter where people we have to give them some space to learn and kind of develop their views before we try to sort of poke around on them.
I do want to point out, though, that the number among independents is pretty striking because generally most independents lean toward one party or the other. So I've got to think that a segment of Republican-leaning independents, I don't know how big, but a non-trivial segment, is alienated by the conviction, no?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair to say. I mean, we've seen, data in that general space throughout the some of the primaries, even like the Republican primaries, where there have been Republicans saying they're defecting from Donald Trump, they're not going to vote for him. Now that is not specifically necessarily about his legal issues, but he's clearly sort of leaking some support among people who would ordinarily traditionally vote Republican.
So the really interesting thing in your poll is you tried to determine how important the conviction is to voters. I mean, look, anyone can tell a pollster, oh, I'm less likely to vote for Trump because of X, and then in the end that doesn't factor in at all. You guys found, however, that 21% of independents say that Trump's conviction both is important to them and will make them less likely to support him. I mean, that's a whole different kind of finding, isn't it?
It is. And, this was an area where, I was sort of keen to try to figure out some way to test the salience of this issue. And obviously, these are all very imperfect tools. There's never been polling in this space before. We've never had to poll in this space before in a presidential election.
Yeah,
and, the Times, they did a version of their own kind of way to test this among their poll respondents, which I thought was quite interesting. And we sort of tried to come up with our own, which is, again, not perfect. Every issue poll is going to have sort of some challenges around it. But I did think the results were interesting precisely for the reason you identified. I didn't expect the number to be that high among people who are saying that this is important to them, they're paying attention to it, and it plausibly will guide their vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to clarify as well that a number of other public polls have confirmed some of these findings generally. I'll just walk through a few of them real quick. A YouGov CBS poll found that 57% of Americans said the jury reached the right verdict. This is in Manhattan, the hush money trial. An ABC News survey found that 50% of Americans said the same. Morning Consult found that 54% of voters approve of the verdict. That's a partial list, but I think plainly the story here is that the verdict is resonating as correct with popular majorities, don't you think?
I do think that that's one takeaway. I do think, though, that those numbers, because I have seen those polls, and there's wrinkles around all of this, but those numbers are not that far from the people who have consistently said that they think Trump is guilty of serious crimes. That number has always hovered around like 48 to 52, I want to say, depending on where and I'm being too precise around it, imprecise numbers here, but like it's always hovered around 50%. So the interesting thing for me has been, okay, well, what is moving those numbers sort of outside the ordinary bounds? I think we're seeing now people maybe sort of dipping their toes more comfortably into this space. We're saying, okay, maybe I wasn't among that 48, 49, 50% of people, but maybe now at the margins, this is something I'm taking seriously.
It's really interesting to contemplate whether the very existence of these polls could encourage people to trust their own instincts on this as well, right? I mean, as you say, we've never really had to deal with a situation where we're polling what voters think of the criminal conviction of one of the major party presidential candidates. But here we are. And so I got to think that, voters who watched the proceedings or read about them or paid attention to them in some sense came away, okay, he was convicted by a jury of his peers. It looked like a legitimate process. And then so to have these polls come out and say majorities are saying the same, got to be encouraging to people to trust that initial instinct, is my guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. First, one of the things I think you've hit on accurately is that we're really in a space where Americans are kind of making history, right? We're in real time, they're deciding what they want to make of this event, how it will influence their voting in November. And then we'll find out in November what actually happens. Because, for a year and change, people like me, we all had our say about this case, right? Well, we thought about it. I got quite a lot of flack for some of the times when I thought about it. But now it's the time for regular American. I mean, I think it's long past, quite honestly, the time for regular Americans to be put sort of front and center in this conversation in terms of what they think about it. But the other thing I would say is, you're right. These polls, including ours, all show sort of around a majority of people sort of accepting the legitimacy of the verdict. But I find those numbers still to be oddly too low. And even our own poll generated some findings sort of on the other side that I was quite surprised by. People who were saying, that they thought that maybe this case was brought to help Joe Biden. A sizable number of people, not a majority, but a sizable chunk of people said that. A sizable number of people either said that they thought that Joe Biden and the Justice Department were involved in bringing this case, or that they didn't know. That was like around 50%. And those are things that are false. Those are views that are false. And they're views that really have only been promulgated, have only been promulgated by Donald Trump, the Republican Party, and their allies in conservative media. But those views are false. There is no evidence, no credible evidence to support it. The only piece of data they've ever been to amass in support of this narrative is that one of the prosecutors on the DA's case used to work at the Justice Department before he moved over. That person also knew Alvin Bragg from long before the case. So there's an alternative explanation, but that's not what people are hearing. Particularly people in these sort of particular media silos have just been treated to Donald Trump's version of events.
Okay, I'm going to try the optimistic take on what you're saying there, all right? And I'll see what you have to say to that. I think one of the big stories of this moment has been that majorities see Trump's trial and conviction as legitimate and fair. Some polls, other public polls, not yours, have found that. You guys found, however, that a plurality, 46%, see the verdict as the result of a fair and impartial judicial process, and that the same percentage of independents said this. I'm going to say that's striking. It is a bit less than other polls, but still, you guys find that around 1/3 of Americans see the proceedings as unfair, which is really a pretty small number. And you find that a majority of 51% rejects the idea that the trial was brought against Trump to help Biden. Look, Trump and his media allies have been blaring out the idea of Trump as a martyred victim of a rigged system, with Biden pulling the strings behind the scenes for months and months. And, would it be nice if it were 80% who reject that? Absolutely. But majorities rejecting it, I think that's pretty good. I take from that the Trump campaign has mostly failed.
I do think that's a fair optimistic take. I guess I would add to that optimistic take if you're inclined to that direction, which is to say, while Trump was on trial, the Democratic Party and the Biden administration and the campaign was really hands off about it, right? So in terms of like what people were hearing, if they wanted to hear from a candidate, it was just Trump. And Trump was talking every day. At the end of every court proceeding, he would go out, he would ramble, spew more lies, and then every media outlet would carry them, I think kind of necessarily, but that is what was happening, even with all the fact checks that was getting through. But the other thing I would mention is that like we now still have like 5 months to go between now and November, and there are still multiple events here where people will have the opportunity to learn more about the proceeding and potentially to be subjects of persuasion and not in a nefarious way. The debate will be happening next week, which is going to be the first time I think we hear these guys speak to one another about the case. It'll be the first time Biden may be asked to speak extemporaneously about the case, and maybe he will have an opportunity in front of his largest audience to speak directly to some of these concerns. The sentencing will take place on July 11th. Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, will be testifying before Congress. All of these events could plausibly help shape people's perceptions of this one way or the other.
I want to grab something you said there and talk about it a bit, which is that Trump said over and over in every conceivable forum that the proceedings are illegitimate, that Republicans and Trump were the ones making the noise and Democrats were not. Let's remember, the Republican Party journeyed up to Manhattan kind of almost like a herd, right? To stand out in front of the proceedings and say that they're entirely illegitimate and any effort to apply the law to Trump is unacceptable, blah, blah, blah. And I agree. Democrats were too quiet throughout that period. I think they should have gone up and said, or maybe not gone up there, but I think that more of them should have stood for the rule of law and said these proceedings are legitimate. The Republican Party is trying to attack the system solely because their nominee is being correctly prosecuted for the crimes he committed. They didn't really do that. Look, now they're engaging a little more, though. I mean, the Biden campaign just rolled out an extremely aggressive new ad, which goes straight for Trump's conviction and labels him a felon and so forth. I think that Democrats are going to engage this much more heavily going forward.
It does appear that way, and that was quite a remarkable coincidence of timing for my purposes. Very fortunate one, because it was like right before my column went up. I read that ad campaign was going live, so it was a real great moment of media synergy for me. But yeah, you're exactly right. I think the correct way to interpret that is that the Biden campaign may be preparing is now engaged in and may be engaged for a longer term period with using this as part of their campaign and trying to put it in a frame that they think favors Biden's reelection.
I do want to also stress that the House of Representatives is under immense pressure from Trump to do something, anything at all, to protect Trump from the federal prosecutions that are currently ongoing or somehow cancel the Manhattan conviction, right? But, and this is a very big tell, right? Vulnerable House Republicans from districts that are not MAGA, that are real swing districts, including some that President Biden carried in 2020, those Republicans are resisting voting for these things protecting Trump. And no matter what the Republican Party tries to say publicly and they're trying very hard to project this sense of unity. They had Trump visit them, and the entire message of that was, we're together behind Trump, even though, he's been convicted. We think it's all bullshit. But behind the scenes, those vulnerable Republicans who are facing non-MAGA voters don't want to vote for stuff protecting Trump.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to be the case. I have also, in the same way that you have maybe sort of marveled at the effort to just try to tell people that, Trump is being railroaded and this is all partisan, right? Including Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who I thought really embarrassed himself and diminished the office through this whole process.
Time.
Yeah, and all those people who, took the hike up to Manhattan, totally humiliating for those people. Whatever they may think they get out of it remains to be seen, but utterly humiliating for those people to say things that either they know are not true or that they're deluded into believing are true. And that effort to sort of just push this narrative by sheer force, as we were talking about, it seems to have had some effect maybe in some certain segments of the population, but it is not a net win for them. It is not a net win for them to be fighting on this terrain. I think the numbers, not just our own, but the others you cited, bear that out. I mean, this is an issue where they're on the losing side of this issue, and they can try to project that bravado as much as they want. But that core dynamic that the cases against Trump are a net negative for him has not changed.
Absolutely. And by the way, I think this is kind of a trap for Republicans. I think your polling bears this out. So that, as you mentioned, the House GOP is holding hearings in July, and they're bringing in Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who successfully prosecuted Trump. They're going to question him and do a big show for Trump, right? The audience of one will be cheering as he watches from the sidelines, I guess, or wherever, from Mar-a-Lago. But the thing is, right, Republicans have to do this because Trump is demanding an aggressive front in his defense. And that will appeal to the base, right? And as your polling shows, because they're already convinced that any effort to apply the law to Trump is illegitimate by definition. But if the middle of the country takes his guilt seriously, as your poll shows, drawing more attention to it with hearings seems like it doesn't help Trump much with the voters that aren't already in his corner. Am I missing something?
Yeah, I mean, look, that very possibly could be correct. And, I don't know what will happen at this hearing beyond that it will be a spectacle full of a bunch of angry accusations from Republicans at Congress who will be not so much questioning Alvin Bragg as my guess, but so much talking at him and trying to gin up clips for social media and conservative media and the like. But I don't think, this is generally a good subject for them. And obviously a lot will turn on how Alvin Bragg performs at that hearing. He hasn't had to speak extemporaneously about this in quite some time. And this was going to be a more challenging environment than the ordinary media interview. It's going to be unlike anything he's ever faced before. So I think that is going to be a very interesting and potentially consequential hearing.
I do want to remind people, though, that a lot of these House Republicans are living in an information environment that's really bubbled off, and they're just absolutely persuaded of stuff that the base already believes. We've seen throughout the Biden years that House Republicans at these hearings go into contact with people who are not MAGA, and then all of a sudden their lines of questioning kind of blow up in their faces. I'm not saying that I know that will happen here, but it certainly seems possible. I mean, the conviction was ratified by a jury of Trump's peers, and I think most legal experts have said, including ones who initially were skeptical of the case, are now saying the prosecution really did a pretty bang-up job of proving the case against Trump. So I really wonder what these House Republicans can accomplish in these hearings.
Yeah, and I would just say, I know Alvin Bragg a little bit. I interned for him when I was in law school quite some time ago, and then I maintained a friendly relationship with him over the years, but nothing intensely personal or anything like that. And the only reason I bring that up is because he is not going to be someone who frothes at the mouth or who easily takes the bait. That's not going to be, I think, where if there are any missteps, they will be, because Alvin Bragg is sort of temperamentally sort of good-natured and very thoughtful and contemplative. There isn't going to be a shouting match between him and Jim Jordan or something like that. But, in the broader issue, to me, and sort of how I think about this issue among the array of other ones, is that I don't think, anyone can say, and we certainly don't say, that this issue will somehow be dispositive and flip the election for Joe Biden. The general election polls still show a very close race. But I do think this is one of those issues, kind of like abortion, one of these issues where when it's in the news, it does not favor Republicans. It's sort of definitionally like a net negative for them. And I think that this election, just from my own sort of layperson's perspective, seems to be shaping up to be a lot like sort of the 2016 election and Hillary Clinton's candidacy, in the sense that there may be a lot of different reasons that people want to vote against Donald Trump. Whether that will be enough of them to prevent him from being reelected, I don't know. But, for some people, it might be abortion is the issue. The economy might be the issue for other people. Immigration for other people. This might be the issue for a small number of marginal voters, including potentially in those swing states. So I agree with your assessment that this is not an issue that sort of generally benefits the Republican Party. I don't think it'll necessarily ever be devastating to them, but it does seem to me, to your point, counterproductive for them to be keeping it in the news in this way.
I do wonder whether it would be interesting to poll public approval versus disapproval of Republicans attacking the system as illegitimate and saying that Trump is a victim and a martyr, versus the alternative position. I got to think, and by the way, that actually seems to not ever get polled, and it would certainly be an interesting thing to figure out. I wonder whether the Republican Party could, in some sense, pay a price for their kind of lockstep defense of Trump, no matter what the facts show and what the legal system decides.
It, to me, seems like an issue that could be unhelpful to people down ballot. Not necessarily because they've taken a strong position, but precisely because it could be one of these things that reduces turnout in a way that disfavors not only Trump, but other Republicans. But again, this is an issue where I think is malleable. And that is one of the issues that the takeaways that I identified in this poll, which is that, like any other issue, whether it's abortion or the economy, like I said, this is an issue where I think people can be targets of persuasion. And I don't mean that in a nefarious way. I mean, literally, people can be moved on this issue. And also that it's an issue whose salience can be elevated or diminished by the campaigns and the media. And so I do view this as sort of a very live issue. But I agree with you that, when Trump has been front and center driving the Republican sort of campaign message the last few cycles, that has not ended well for the party.
Anyway, your poll was really, really, really instructive and informative, and we really appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Everybody, we have some great new content for you up at TNR.com. Timothy Noah on how replacing taxes with tariffs, as Trump wants, would take us back to the 1800s. And Tom Hartman on the MAGA lie machine and how it's gearing up on every issue from the border to bump stocks. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.